Good evening, and welcome again to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery. Behind me you'll see, I think, some of the hydrangea bushes which are just beginning to bloom. This evening I wanted to touch on two subjects. We'll make two recordings. One I said I would take up the Old Testament is about you, and we'll do that in the second recording. The first one I want to talk about, though, is a question that has arisen, and that is about an Orthodox worldview. And I can't say that there is an Orthodox worldview. There are a number of worldviews within the Orthodox Church, and we can't say one is less valid than the other. So let's take one perspective and say that an Orthodox worldview would be that the Church is in the world not only to gather the faithful and set them apart from the world, which is almost impossible, but also to sanctify the world. A part of the ministry of the Church is the sanctification of creation. The Apostle Paul tells us that all creation is being redeemed together with mankind, that the whole of creation had fallen into infirmity not by its own will, but by the will of him who so subjected it, and yet with hope, and that the creation toils and labors until now, waiting for the revelation of God's children. So our redemption is tied together with the redemption of the whole created universe. And this is why we never speak about the destruction of the universe at the end of time, at the second coming, but the transfigured cosmos, the transfiguration of the universe. It cannot be that God will destroy the works of his own hands this way. And consequently, the universe will be transfigured into what it was intended to be and is intended to become, according to the will of God. But as an Orthodox Christian worldview, we also have to look back at the early Christians in apostolic times and just after apostolic times. And it's notable that Christians were condemned in earlier times in part for their great charity and their openness to the weak, the poor, and the hungry of the world. Indeed, we read many such complaints. Pliny, writing to the emperor, complains that the Christians are looking after the poor. One writer complains to Emperor Nero that they're looking after the poor, and he said, "Whose poor? Mine or theirs?" And the writer replies, "They're looking after your poor." So then they should be condemned to death, of course. But even when Julian the Apostate set out to try to restore paganism and destroy Christianity, he remarked that he despaired of any success because of the open-hearted charity of the Christians and how they looked after all without distinction, how they would look after anyone who needed, and the great benefits that they gave through medical care and the study of medicine, even a kind of primitive medical science that was developing within the church. And this is why he despaired of turning people back to paganism. So an Orthodox Christian worldview has to include the idea of looking after the poor and the weak and all those whom the holy prophets commanded us to look after, the poor, the weak, the orphans, the hungry, those who are ill, and trying to care for all equally without distinction. We cannot say that it is an Orthodox Christian worldview that we despise the created world. The systems, cultures of the world, perhaps, we should reject. But the created world and the humanity that occupy this world are those to whom we should open our hearts and our care and our concern as we seek to sanctify rather than to condemn, and to lift up rather than to push down. And we cannot say that our Orthodox worldview would consist in turning a dark eye toward the world or turning our back upon the world itself. We have many kind of morbid, dark, almost tragic and sad worldviews that are presented even within the Orthodox Church. But I would like to suggest that they're totally inconsistent with the history of the church and with the apostolic Christians, who were just the opposite. They rejected a worldly system and yet obeyed the laws. They rejected the worldly culture and society and yet reached out into that culture and society to help anyone who needed their help and whom they could help. They turned their back on no one. They condemned no one. They cursed no one. And they did not take a bleak, morbid view that being as miserable and unhappy as possible was the only way to be a true Christian.